Come with me to a magical place where being labeled the Pork Queen is a compliment, where being nice is just a way of life, and where all leaders of the free world must pass through. Welcome to Iowa. Whether you're a current Iowan, an Iowa expat, or an Iowan at heart, this show is for you. This is the Iowa Podcast. Real Iowans, real talk, no drama. I'm Justin Brady, and did you know that tomorrow Iowa became a state? Man, that sounds a little confusing, I know, but hundreds of years ago, well, not hundreds, but in 1846, Iowa became the 29th state, and so that sounds like a pretty good topic to discuss on the Iowa Podcast. I mean, that is the name of the show. So we've brought in Leo Landis, the state curator of the State Historical Society of Iowa. Leo, thanks for coming on the show.
Great to be with you, Justin.
You have a big do you have one of those unfolding business cards? Because you're also the museum coordinator of the State Historical Museum of Iowa. So that's a lot.
We're able to put two lines on there.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
Yep.
So, President, well, you sent me this before, which is very, very fascinating. But I wanted to ask you, how exactly does a state become a state? And then you also had this really interesting entry from the president at the time, President James Polk. So let's start there. How does this whole thing work?
Sure. So the bill to make Iowa a state was introduced in March of 1845. So, even a year and a half almost before statehood, we were being proposed as a state along with Florida. So March 3rd, 1845. A constitution was approved, and again, it's only white men voting in Iowa at the time, so often they'll say the voters of Iowa approved. Well, you've got to keep in mind that that's white men aged 21 or over.
Yep.
And so that gets submitted, but the time our northern boundary was proposed to run from around Sioux City up to the Falls of St. Anthony, which is the Twin Cities. So our northern border was going to be huge. And Congress didn't like that. They voted down the first effort to make Iowa a state. That's why it took from March 1845 to January of 1846 for Iowa to become a state, because the federal government did not like our proposed northern border.
Oh, interesting. So it was all about the northern border.
It was at the time, because a lot of your listeners may know the Honey War story that goes back to the territorial period.
Yep, on the south, we talked about
on the southern border, and
yeah.
that was still being discussed, and actually does go to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1851. That's the last border to be officially established, is our southern border. But there was only minor contention over that. It was the fact that Minnesota was a territory, Iowa was a territory. Where is the northern Iowa border going to go? And that Constitution of 1844 was sending it up to the Twin Cities, and it wasn't a straight line across. It was initially a diagonal running from present-day northwest Iowa up to the Twin Cities. So we were going to have a kind of a weird angled border that way.
Okay.
So we get voted down in that 1844 Constitution. 1846 Constitution gets proposed and ratified in the summer of 1846. Congress looks at the new proposed northern border, says we support that. And so I think it's September of 46, might have been August of 46. Congress approves that. Still takes President Polk about two and a half months to sign the bill. I honestly don't know why there's that gap between the congressional approval of our northern border, and I've done enough reading on it that nobody says, here's the issue.
Well, it's politics, right?
And
same as then, same as today.
It could also be just, what is the pressing business of the time? And so it takes until that December 28th day, December 28th, yeah, there we go. December 28th date where President Polk, signs the bill that makes Iowa the 29th state, as you said. So,
and for those that don't remember the Honey War thing, we talked about that, I want to say 4 to 5 episodes ago. You can scroll back through your podcast apps, everyone, but that was basically Iowa kind of skirmished with Missouri. Right. We talked about that briefly.
The Missouri governor is trying to bring in more taxpayers to Missouri and saying, that survey line from the falls of the Des Moines River should be a little farther north. And so Missouri wants more land, and Iowans of Iowa territory don't want to be there.
So Congress is super concerned about Iowa having too much space, but they just kind of let things go for some of the other states like Texas and California. They just didn't care that much back then.
And for Texas, again, that's part of the whole James K. Polk, the president's viewed as a bit of a dictator because he thrusts U.S. into this war in Texas to, bring more territory in. So that was one of the things that you see through the 1846 period is Whig newspapers, the competing party to the Democrats, complaining about, James K. Polk, and just a fascinating president in and of itself. When he ran as president, he said, "I'm only going to serve one term." So
interesting.
He went in saying, and he would put in 12-hour days. Harry Truman put him in his top 10 presidents of all time. So he's often regarded as a very effective president because he came in, he did what he said he was going to do. The Mexican War does kind of get thrust upon him, but brings in a whole new set of territory to the U.S., somewhat unpopular because it's bringing in states south of the Missouri Compromise line, the Mason-Dixon line, which means that's going to be more potential slavery territory state. So, not a popular war. Then Representative Lincoln gives calls him a dictator essentially in the U.S. House. So, Polk had a lot of attacks, but the thing that's beautiful about him and what we're really talking about is he keeps fabulous diaries. And so we know what Polk was doing every day of his presidency in certain ways. Not every president always kept a diary, or sometimes they would get lost or destroyed. Well, Polk's diaries...
Yeah, I was going to say, what's the entry on today then? Or I guess this would be tomorrow,
for December 28th, he says, an unusual number of visitors called this morning, and among them many members of Congress. With but few exceptions, they were all on business of seeking office for their friends.
Of course.
Yeah, and he goes on.
Of course.
He talks about Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri visiting, and then he references a judge visiting, and then he concludes by, "Nothing of much interest occurred today." Never says a thing about Iowa.
Gee, thanks.
Yeah, never says a thing about it. So for Iowa historians, that's one of those where...
We're kind of used to that here in Iowa, though.
That's right.
Like we get right now it's caucus time. Maybe we get into a little old school, like really old. You mentioned old parties. Maybe we can get into that if we have time. But Iowans are kind of used to that. We're kind of, the flyover state. It seems like when we were first... when we first became a state, it started then.
and that's something I think, a lot of people don't always realize is, when we became a state, the counties that we have today, the 99 counties, essentially west of Polk County was not an organized territory. So if you drew, Madison County south, you've got Clark and Decatur, those had been organized, but then Boone County wasn't organized yet. You go kind of up to Blackhawk County, that's already a county, but from the western part of the state isn't organized. And even something like Osceola County doesn't formalize its government till after the Civil War. So, 1871.
So Iowa was kind of a patchwork of counties that existed, but there was just a bunch of space that was technically Iowa, but not a county and not exactly locally governed at that point.
Correct. There was people weren't settling and living there, and that's why you think, to 1857, where you've got the Spirit Lake conflict, the Dakota people, the Wapakute Dakota band, saw northwest Iowa as some of their ancestral land. It hadn't been totally negotiated yet. And so contested land up there through the 1860s into the 1870s. And while Lyon County on the Rock River, and it wasn't even Lyon County till the Civil War, it was Buncombe County, excuse me. It changes its name. So you get things like that, too, where we had Yell County, which no longer exists. I think that was either Webster or Hamilton. So county names were in flux even through the 50s and 60s.
Through the 50s and 60s, that was my question, is like, so through the 50s and 60s, Iowa counties weren't actually the 99 counties we know today. When did it all stop? Because I know that our friends up in northwestern Iowa who have... that used to be, I can't remember the county name off the top of my head. I'm blanking.
It's Bancroft is what you're thinking of.
It used to be 2, now it's 1.
Yep.
That made us 99, took it from 100 to 99. When did that all end? When did we finally decide?
There was the last ditch effort in the 1860s to split off what had been Bancroft County, and that's, you think of the town of Bancroft in Kossuth County today, so that's going to be Bancroft County.
Mm-hmm.
They merge into Kossuth in the 1850s. After the Civil War is over, they try to create a new county out of there called Crocker. State law was that you couldn't create a new county. If they'd called it Bancroft again, it could have succeeded. We could have 100 counties with Bancroft and Kossuth being apart. But
so this might be a little tangent. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but are counties some required thing? Is there, when a state receives statehood, is there some federal law that Congress says you have to have counties, or is that kind of just the way states do it?
That is typically the way most northern states have done it, is to create counties. You've got parishes in the South, which is essentially a county, where I think of Louisiana and maybe, I'm trying to think if there's any other southern states that have parishes. Louisiana is the one I can think of.
Yeah.
But, having smaller organizational units, and it's really the Northwest Ordinance and Northwest Territory creation of the 1890s that says, oh, here's how you organize counties. And so lays out that you're going to have 16 townships if it's square, and each township's going to have this number of sections. And I think it's 16. I could be wrong. It might be 64 sections, 64. Man, I didn't study up on my so there's
history of counties in the U.S.
and creation, and it really is. It's through the Northwest Ordinance and the creation of new how to bring territories in that sets up how to survey the land, break it into these square grids of counties.
Yeah.
And so when we come in, yes, it is established. Here is how you set up a new state, a new territory, and the process of becoming a state.
So my wife and I were just in Paris a couple weeks ago, and we were eating at a restaurant, and behind us is this giant golden dome. And I asked the server, I was like, "Is that Napoleon's?" Because I've heard that his tombstone's there. His tombstone is in Paris. And so I was like, "Is that his tombstone? Is that like, yeah?" It's this big golden, of course, ornate building. A lot of people forget, just taking a walk down history here, is that we actually bought modern day Iowa. It wasn't Iowa at the time, in 1803 from the French, right? And so at what point did the French, because I think they had trading posts or some activity in Iowa, not a huge military presence, because Napoleon obviously needed to fund his war effort in Europe. At what point were the French moving out? Were there still some French settlements here in Iowa at the time of purchase? What was exactly here before Iowa became a state? What was going on?
Yeah, it really was native people. The French did not have a strong permanent settlement in Iowa, like you think of St. Louis or what becomes St. Louis today. Mm-hmm. So hadn't moved up. I mean, there are fur trading spots, Prairie du Chien.
Yeah.
So across from Iowa, you've got things like Prairie du Chien as a settlement with French establishment. But really, the Spanish almost have as much significance in the short time that they own that territory, because not only does Julian Dubuque, again, a French-Canadian, probably some American Indian ancestry there too, he doesn't just negotiate with the Meskwaki, who control that part of Iowa at the time, or what would become Iowa, the Upper Mississippi. We'll call it the Upper Mississippi. So he negotiates with the Meskwaki to mine lead, but he also has to negotiate with the Spanish. That's why it's the mines of Spain up in Dubuque, because it was Spanish territory for that short 1880s, early 1890s period before Spain and France renegotiate to sell it back to the French. So when President Jefferson purchases the Louisiana territory, it is purchased from the French, as you noted, but it's that short period too where we're also part of what we became had been part of Spain.
Yeah, because I knew that the French obviously didn't have the capacity, because the United States is really far removed from France, obviously, and that far removed from Europe. So I did know that they didn't have a huge presence here. They did have military posts in random spots and patrols, and they had I think what I read before
fur trading posts, and that's what Prairie du Chien is,
right?
And then Prairie du Chien becomes a treaty negotiation spot for the U.S. So the treaty that establishes some of the zones in 1830, I think is the year, is negotiated in Prairie du Chien, but it's what says, okay, the Winnebago or the Ho-Chunk, they've got that kind of rectangular diagonal in northwest Iowa, and that's why in 1846, Allamaquee and Winneshiek hadn't been a county yet because that's still Winnebago Ho-Chunk land. And then as they're negotiated out in 1846, then in early 1847, you get Winneshiek and Allamaquee counties established in early 1847. So the French certainly are trying to protect their interests.
Right. Yeah.
And then the U.S. as well, and that's what the negotiations to remove Native peoples does.
Interesting, which is a whole topic in and of itself.
Right.
So is that when negotiations to remove Native people, what does that even look like? Like, is it just the U.S. says, hey, we're a state now, y'all get out? Or is it actually a real negotiation? Or is it more we're acting like we're negotiating with you, but we have a pointy stick in the other hand? What does that look like? So
efforts were made to build alliances within the different Native nations. And that's, I think, important for a lot of us. We forget that, every different Native tribe is essentially a foreign nation. So the United States government would say, hey, there's going to be a treaty negotiation at Prairie du Chien in 1830. They would call in the elders, the chiefs of that nation, and say, but we know that the Ho-Chunk need to be represented here, and we know that the Sac or the Sauk need to be represented, and that the Fox or the Meskwaki, and that's part of, again, that French history is the French thought that the Sauk and Meskwaki were all one people, or the Sac and the Fox, and so really they're two different nations. So they get that legacy of the name, but the Fox were the Meskwaki, and that's why they're the Sac and Fox of the Mississippi that own land here in Iowa. They don't ever want to really leave. They've been forced out of enough places that they say, we're going to try to stay and negotiate, again, a little off topic, but in 1857, negotiate to buy land in Iowa. So you've got the Meskwaki settlement, which is not a reservation. It is purchased land. So the Ho-Chunk, the Potawatomi, and the Dakota, who are the northern band of Sioux, are being represented at treaty negotiations. So they really are negotiations, but the United States government is doing all it can to find the most compliant leaders within the nation to say, oh, here's, the kind of allotment we'll give you. Here's where we want to remove you to.
Sure. Yeah.
So you're pretty correct in saying the Native peoples didn't have a lot of a choice in those negotiations. They had seen over generations what had happened. I mean, the Potawatomi had been in Indiana around the Great Lakes. And, they first get moved to Illinois, and then it's like, oh, and now you're...
So it's more a trying to keep the peace and not inflare and not raise tensions than it is a real negotiation, kind of. It's kind of like, we're going to do this anyway, but we're going to try to mitigate as much damage on either side here instead of a true negotiation.
For the most part, was one-sided.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
The U.S. government didn't give, that's part of the Dakota Wars of the 1860s, is the Dakota are trying to say, hey, you have promised us these things, and you are not living up to your allotment agreements. And so you get, in the middle of the United States Civil War, a group of Dakota, or the Sioux that are in southern Minnesota, rising up against the United States government.
So who exactly was this forming of Iowa? Was it more of a Congress saying we want that property and we're going to, they already had the property, but we want that to be a state and we're going to form that? Or was it local residents that technically weren't a state yet that petitioned the government to be included in statehood? Like, was this essentially a territory, kind of like, the United States has territories all over the world, or a few. And so was this a kind of what Iowa was, and the residents said, hey, Congress, we want to be included as a state?
And you have to reach a population level. And again, I can't remember if it's 20,000, 40,000. I'm sure one of your listeners is going to say, I can't believe the guy didn't know the population level before you can petition.
Why don't you know all of American history?
Well, that's a biggie where I should, but I didn't double check, and I don't want it. It's in the, it's around 20,000, I think.
Yeah.
Where once the federal government will say, we're going to establish the Michigan Territory. And when Michigan Territory reaches a certain population, they can, whenever they're ready, petition for statehood. And that means, creating a state constitution and having a vote on it, and then writing a bill establishing, what your boundaries and et cetera are.
Yeah.
And so that is the process that gets, again, put forward in the Northwest Ordinance of the 1890s, saying here's how new states can happen. And so that happens in Alabama. It happens in Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon, any state after essentially 1800. Ohio, in 1803, I think is their statehood date. Has to go through, has to go through that sort of process. Now, again, Ohio had been open for settlement, but that's the Northwest Ordinance is kind of the precursor to the Louisiana Purchase, where through the end of the American Revolution, we negotiate to say, this territory that's Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota is part of what the United States is going to get as part of the settlement for Western land in the treaty that ends the American Revolution. So that Northwest Ordinance and Northwest Territory is, especially because they're all Midwestern states, just like Iowa, sets up what is like, this makes sense. Iowa's going to be a lot like those states, even though we come in the Louisiana Purchase, same with Missouri. Yeah. And part of Minnesota comes in on the Louisiana Purchase, if I remember. I think it's, what's west of the Mississippi essentially is not Northwest Ordinance.
I can't remember the exact borders, but I probably wasn't paying much attention in high school when we talked about that.
Yeah, so that whole Northwest Ordinance is what sets up the process for statehood.
You do bring up Minnesota this is probably a whole nother podcast that they should have called if there's the Minnesota podcast, maybe someone can run this story, but they've had some controversy in their state seal. And that kind of brings up, what is the formation of a state seal like? How did that happen in Iowa? And what was the point of a state seal? Were we branding boxes with these things? I imagine it's not just someone just said, hey, we should have a state seal. I imagine there was some purpose at some point.
It still is a purpose. So if there is ever a law declared by the state of Iowa, it has to have the appropriate signatures, be published, but once the governor signs it, it gets the state seal.
Oh.
So it is critical for any state to have a state seal. It's only for use by the executive officer of the state, the governor.
Oh.
So if we ever print the state seal in the State Historical Museum, we always ask the governor's office.
No way.
You're not supposed to use the state seal without the permission of the state's executive officer.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, and people occasionally do that, but we wanted to show what the different symbols, because the symbols on the Iowa State seal, some of them still kind of make sense, but a lot of them are like, I don't know what's going on that state seal. It looks like there's a log cabin on it on the right side. Well, that log cabin is a lead furnace.
Oh.
Because lead was going to be our big monetary generator besides agriculture because of the lead mines around Dubuque. It's like, so we should put a lead furnace on our state seal. So if you look at the bill was written in February of 1847, so we've just become a state, one of their first actions. And funny, going back to President Polk, I'm not sure if Thomas Hart Benton, the senator from Missouri, was talking to him about Iowa in 1846, but it's his nephew, Thomas Hart Benton, who's part of the committee that creates the Iowa State seal. It's a guy named Senator Bradley and Francis Springer and Thomas Hart Benton of Iowa, who's a state senator. So he's the nephew of the federal senator. It's like, I wonder if Thomas Hart Benton, the senator from Missouri, was saying, my nephew is over there in that Iowa territory. You need to sign that bill today. I have no idea, because Polk doesn't tell us, but you've got those three guys who in February of 1847 create the state seal. So you've got the citizen soldier in the middle. Most of us can kind of recognize that guy. There isn't corn on the Iowa State seal.
Interesting.
It's wheat, because wheat is the cash crop of the time, and that's what we cared about. It's not like Iowa grows a lot of corn that we cared about. It's like Iowa is part of the breadbasket or the burgeoning breadbasket of the Midwest. So wheat is a big deal, and it's wheat harvesting items. So there's a sheaf of wheat, and the utensils. I know there's a scythe, which is the long-handled thing that cuts wheat. I could get into more detail on that, but that's all we need to say. There's the plow, so that's about tillage and farming. And then just talking about the Minnesota seal a little bit, they now have a loon, and it's kind of and has their state motto on it, the Star of the North, which is in French. but they had an American Indian fleeing from the state, and the state of Minnesota
on the
said,
seal.
Yeah, on the seal. Yeah, with a farmer.
Not
and
exactly a good
it's
look.
like, let's drive out the American Indians. Well,
wow.
American Indians who still have a strong presence in our state, but the Minnesota American Indians are like, that's not really a favorable look at our people. It doesn't make us feel welcome. So Minnesota did redesign their state seal, and now it's a loon with the lake and the North Star.
Oh, now it's a loon with the lake.
Yeah,
so it
that's
didn't have the loon
one.
on it before.
It did not. No.
Oh,
yeah, the new seal, the prominent figure is a loon.
Oh, because
I'm not sure what that says about Minnesotans. I mean, I know it's a great.
I used to live there. You can make fun of them.
Yeah. Anyway, so besides the.
That is super funny, because that was going to be my question. Is I don't like, was the loon the state bird way back when they had the original seal? But that's the new seal.
That's the new seal. Yeah, the old seal was a farmer and an American Indian fleeing on a horse, and so kind of a typical United States seal was the Minnesota one. And they're like, oh, it really doesn't show our state being welcoming to Native peoples. They were trying to drive them.
What was the point of that initially? Like, we drove out. It was at the time, was it like a conquer statement? Like, we took over this land from the invaders, and look at us, how great we are, kind of a thing. Almost like a French. Well, actually, military back in that period, everyone was driving everyone out all the time and beating their chest. Like, that's why France is such a cool, like a big country, and Paris is ornate because of Napoleon.
Yeah, it was really more of, this is what improvement and civilization means.
Yeah,
and really,
wow.
and I'm using that term improvement because that's what it was in the United States agricultural
That's
census.
what they considered it.
Yeah, is how much improved land. So when they come into Iowa and say, who's doing farming in 1850, they'll say, how much land have you improved? And if Native people are using that land, it wasn't viewed at the time as, making good use of the land. So let's make better use of the land by having farmers on it and driving out the American Indians. So that's really, I think, to me, what's being represented is that the 19th century idea of what it meant to improve a place was to put it into farmland.
Yeah, because a superior agricultural technology and approaches. That's
what, in a different way, you're showing on the Iowa seal with that citizen farmer, citizen soldier, I should say, and then the farm tools behind him.
Just without the driving out imagery.
Yeah, and then the other thing that you get, if I can just say one more thing, that most Iowans don't know about our state seal. So it's got the U.S. flag on it.
Uh-huh.
On top of the U.S. flag, if you look at our seal closely, there's this little clump of fabric on top of that. Well, going back to your French idea, it's a Phrygian or liberty cap, which was part of the French citizenry rising up on the heels of the American Revolution, saying we are, and it went back supposedly to Roman history that men who had red caps on indicated that they were free men, not enslaved.
Wow.
And so on the Iowa seal, on top of the U.S. flag, if you look, there's this little clump of fabric, and when it's done in color, it's red.
You can see it.
Because it's a liberty cap, and that's explicitly said in the legislation that created our state seal, is it should have a liberty cap on top of the flag.
People forget, and I honestly forgot until we visited France, like how intertwined France and even the state of Iowa is, but of course the United States. Like, we forget that we purchased the land from France. We forget that France helped us, fend off the British. Like, we were kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of screwed, and at the last thread of our rope or something. I'm not using the right terminology. And the French Navy came in and kind of saved our rear ends. A lot of people kind of forget that. So, I guess we have Napoleon to thank for a lot of that too. So,
or then it would have been King Louis. But,
King Louis. Yeah. And so caucus time is here. This is another thing I want to talk to you about, because you just mentioned that the party structure, like right now, everyone thinks of the Republicans and the Democrats, right? Obviously, there's libertarians and there's the Green Party, and there's, I think Andrew Yang has a new party now called the Forward Party. But I think we just kind of think that, the two-party system's always been here. It's not going to change. That's actually not true, right?
Correct. And that's what's really interesting about the time Iowa becomes a state. Most people thought that James K. Polk was going to lose to Henry Clay. Henry Clay was a Kentuckian, and he was kind of a middle-of-the-road Whig, W-H-I-G.
Right.
That was the successors, essentially, to the Federalists, which is why President Washington never would have called himself a Federalist, but Washington and Adams are part of this group who are, thinking of themselves as what becomes Federalist, and then they become Whigs. The Democrats kind of get their start with President Jefferson, but President Jackson really is who kind of cements that idea of the Democratic Party. So the counter to the Democrats are the Whig Party at the time, and Democrats are tolerant and really are, strong executive. The executive can do whatever he wants, much like Andrew Jackson and killing the, Bank of the United States, things like that. Both are expansionist. Want to keep going to the Western Ocean of the Pacific. So they both, but the Whigs have this idea about internal improvements. So the ideas of building canals, building railroads, even to a degree being a bit anti-immigrant is part of that Whig Party ideal. And whereas the Democrats are farm-based and more rural, and again, still have that expansionist idea. But the schism that you get within the Whig Party is you've got people like Henry Clay who own and enslave people. So they are enslaving black people. And then there is the abolitionist movement developing in the northern states at the time that says, we do not believe in enslaving people. And so there's a schism in the Whig Party in the early 1850s. They split up, and there's this need for a new party connected to free soil, where the whole nation should allow freedom for all people. They don't necessarily believe in equality, but they certainly don't believe in slavery.
Sure.
And so that then gives rise to the Republican Party in 1854. Iowa's Republican Party gets its first gubernatorial candidate in 1858, I think, is with Lowe.
Goodness.
So you've got this new party, that gives us kind of the structure we know today. Just, the parties have changed over time, too.
Yeah, there's a lot. And I have so much more. Like, I wanted to talk about old school elections, the governor elections, but now we're over, I'm over a minute over, which was certainly worth it. But on this Statehood Day, is that officially the name, by the way, Statehood Day?
Sometimes we've had Governor Reynolds proclaim Statehood Day, like for 175th. So again, it gets the governor's state seal when you get an official day. Right now, we do not have an official day, but it's an unofficial day.
What happens if someone uses a state seal without permission? Are you the one that kicks in the door?
I don't know if there's any penalty. It's just
don't do it. You don't want to find out. There's a dark locker somewhere you get tossed into, and Leo's going to come. He's going to drag you out of your house and beat you senseless. Just kidding. Leo Landis, State Curator of the State Historical Society of Iowa and Museum Curator at the State Historical Museum of Iowa. I think right after this, you're going to give a tour. So if people want to get tours, or if people want to reach out and learn more about our great state, how do they do that?
Yep. Thanks for asking. Museum is currently open Tuesdays through Saturdays. The Tuesday, Friday hours are 9 to 4:30, Saturdays 9 to 3 o'clock. And we're doing, if somebody happens to catch this on the 29th, there's some guided tours that you can sign up for, or you can just drop in and explore on your own.
Leo, thank you so much for joining me and all the listeners on the Iowa podcast. I certainly appreciate it. I know all of them. I know all that they do as well.
You're welcome. And I should have said, if they want to know more, go to history.iowa.gov. That's the way to see what's going on.
Perfect. Thanks again, Leo.
You're welcome.
And to my fellow Iowans, Iowa expats, and Iowans at heart, thanks for listening and subscribing to the Iowa podcast.